Welcome back, everybody, to part 2 of this very much anticipated series, learning more about Otto von Bismarck, one of the most remarkable men to ever live, and one of the most consequential men in European history, certainly, if not world history. Little late in the day to be getting this video live, but I promised I would do this daily until we got through the series, so we're doing that. Had a stream this afternoon, and so it took a little while to get to this video, but we're ready to dive into it. Now, a lot of you know by now that I'm really into researching family history, and I love finding connections from one time period to another. And so as we dive into this one today, just a couple of cool tidbits about the Bismarck family. And that is that his family, even after his death, continued to be very active and involved in the events happening in Germany. In fact, two of his grandsons were elected in 1933 as Nazi members of the Reichstag. So they both became Nazi party members, got elected. At least one of them served all the way through to the end of the war in the Reichstag as a member of the Nazi party. I know one of those grandsons, I believe it was the other one, ended up a major general in the SS, but got very much disillusioned with what the Nazi movement was doing and with the war in particular, and ended up, by 1944, becoming aware of the Stauffenberg plot, the one that you see in the movie Valkyrie, the bombing in July of 1944 on Adolf Hitler. He was not directly involved in the planning of it, but he was aware of it. But because of the fact that he was a Bismarck and the family name and everything that carried with it, he escaped any real responsibility for his involvement or for his knowledge of that plot, like so many others who were punished for that. So just some cool tidbits, and I'll try to throw some more out there at the beginning of each episode if I think to. But let's go ahead and dive into part 2.
1848. The People's Spring. Springtime of Nations. The Year of Revolution. Bismarck's political life ended nearly as abruptly as it started. For as the summer of 1847 began, the king, unable to get a railroad grant from the Diet without also granting a constitution, threw his hands up in the air, dissolved the Diet, and sent everybody packing. Bismarck went back home to his estate, finally completed that whole business of getting married, and went on his honeymoon. But as he traveled Europe, and when he returned home, he noticed a strange tension in the air, an unrest in the streets, in the cities. Then, in February 1848, Paris erupted. The monarchy fell. A republic was re-established in France. Bismarck was concerned. At home and abroad, he had seen the strain between the working class and those who ruled, but...
So you got to remember, for my fellow Americans, we have a pretty large country. It's not the largest one in the world, but certainly large compared to the nations of Europe. And so it's hard for us to think about, and the U.S. is fairly isolated from a lot of the other major players in the world. We've got Canada to the north, Mexico to the south, but, we're not surrounded by other equally powerful nations. And so it's hard to kind of relate to this, but understand in the 1840s that what happens in a neighboring power in Europe very much affects what happens. We're not talking a huge long distance between Paris and Berlin. It's not really all that far. And so these two countries who border each other, both major influential powers in the world, when revolution breaks out in France, and you already have unrest and you have people demanding a constitution in Germany, you can bet that what happened in France was absolutely going to inspire the people of Germany to be that much more bold in demanding a constitution.
He never expected something so abrupt or so successful to happen in France. Then Vienna fell. Metternich, the great Austrian statesman and architect of the Concert of Europe, was displaced. This opened up an opportunity, as the Austrians had long been the dominant force among German states, but it also served as a warning. It was clear that revolution was coming to Prussia soon. But Bismarck worried that the king was too weak and too vacillating to put down a revolution. And he was right. As word of the revolution in Vienna spread, Prussians took to the streets, and soon the king promised them a constitutional government. But as the people were celebrating their victory in Berlin, the celebration turned into a clash. Shots were fired. Government troops killed revolutionaries.
if you watched the series we just did on Oversimplified, the Russian Revolution, doesn't this sound awfully familiar? People clashing in the streets, government troops firing on the people that are protesting. Same thing happened on a much smaller scale with the American Revolution in the early days before the Revolution, with what we call the Boston Massacre, which was really just a small number of American colonial civilians who were taunting and egging on and throwing stuff at troops and almost dared them to shoot, and they did. So this seems to be a common theme that leads to these things.
Many, including Bismarck, believed that now there was no choice but to crush the revolution. The king, though, disagreed and ordered the troops out of Berlin, effectively leaving himself hostage to the revolution. And then came the first of Bismarck's good-ish ideas. He raced back to his estate and organized an old-school peasant levy. Yes, in the middle of the 19th century, he tried to press his peasants into service as their feudal lord.
What? This is awesome. This is like totally something you would see in the 1400s. You're going to go back and get the people who are working your land to take up arms in defense of the king. That's fantastic. I can't believe it failed.
In order to put down a revolution whose stated goals were to enfranchise and empower those same peasants. With this great idea in mind, he handed them all shotguns and said, "Come on, lads, to Berlin." But just as they were storming off, one of his spoil-sport neighbors came out and told him to stop hurling a firebrand into the country, threatening to talk the peasants out of this nonsense. Bismarck politely replied, "You know that I am a quiet man, but if you do that, I shall shoot you." So
now that sounds like a good idea, at least as far as Bismarck's concerned. This is a guy who was in monthly duels when he was in school. Of course he threatened to kill the guy.
with revolver in hand and four bullets in his pocket, he led his feudal levy to go liberate the king. Unfortunately, when he got to the first army camp, which was staffed by many of the conservative officers that he had come to mingle with after making his fiery speeches in Berlin, he was promptly told, "Yes, we are all a bit disappointed right now, but no, we really don't want your peasant mob messing this up even more, so how about you go send your peasants back and bring us some corn and potatoes or something?"
So you have to say this about Bismarck, and boy, the more I learn about him, the more I like him, you know? I mean, I don't know if other people feel that way, but this is a guy who really takes the idea to heart, go big or go home. Like, he doesn't sit around and wait for anything to happen. He will make things happen. Even if that means that occasionally he has some really bad ideas about how to do that, this is how you learn what works and what doesn't work, right?
Not content to serve as mere fodder provider for the army, Otto then had his second good-ish idea. He left his estate and tried to sneak into Berlin again, with the cleverest of ruses, trimming his beard. Needless to say, many people saw through his incredible mind games, and soon he was laughed out of Berlin. But Bismarck was not done. He had a third good-ish idea. With the king making ever greater concessions to the revolutionaries, Bismarck saw it as his place to help elevate one of the king's relatives to the throne. So Bismarck went all in on trying to replace King Frederick Wilhelm with a confusingly but more succinctly named King Wilhelm. But Wilhelm had legged it to England, and he wasn't going to listen to this wild man anyway. So Bismarck began to hunt for a new candidate. Soon he found another royal relative named Charles, who proposed that his even more confusingly named son, Frederick Wilhelm, should replace Frederick Wilhelm on the throne. This Frederick Wilhelm, or Fritz, I'm going to call him Fritz, was 6 years old. But nobody had asked Fritz's mom. I mean, they eventually did, but more as an afterthought, with Bismarck awkwardly meeting her in her servants' quarters.
All right, so as a guy who's been married for 18 years, which I know is not that long in the grand scheme of things, but it's longer than a lot of people are married, don't ever do that. Don't ever make a big plan to put some kid on the throne without talking to the mom first. You're not only going to get the kid in trouble, you're going to get dad in trouble if dad's around at all. And even if he's not, ask mom. Good idea.
Not asking turned out to be a mistake, though, because Fritz's mom supported the liberals and put the kibosh on the whole thing. It would seem that Bismarck had made an enemy of the mother of this 6-year-old he hoped to put on the throne. Nonetheless, he was soon summoned for the Second Prussian Diet, which the king had ordered assembled to hammer out how to make a real parliament for Prussia. There, Bismarck spoke passionately about the noble past that they were so casually throwing away, even becoming choked with emotion and having to stop mid-speech. But to no avail. The Diet did its job and created the Prussian National Assembly, which Bismarck was very not elected to.
Very not elected to, but I guarantee you that what Bismarck is good at is eventually reading the room. Now, obviously, he's going to fight for what he believes in, and he believes strongly in the monarchy. But when you see the handwritings on the wall, when you see that this is the direction you're going, you can either keep fighting against the inevitable, or you can embrace it and use it. So what do you think Bismarck's going to do?
This Prussian National Assembly pushed for a real parliamentary system along British lines, though, and soon the king began to lose patience with the body. So Bismarck joined the Camarilla, which was not in fact a secret society of vampires which has kept their presence hidden from humanity for hundreds of years, though I can understand your confusion, and let's be honest, Bismarck would have made a great vampire, but no. Bismarck joined the much more boring, but real, group of nobles and courtiers close to the king, who were determined to maintain the power of the monarchy through non-vampiric means. And let's go ahead and call this one Bismarck's first actual good idea, because this put him in contact with many powerful men. But even though, by all accounts, he was an effective member of the society, and even though he had amplified the conservative voice in Prussian politics by establishing a newspaper, when the liberal cause fell apart and the conservatives once again became ascendant, he was passed over for a cabinet position. They were very happy to use him when a radical was needed, but once the time came to re-establish order, the wild man was cast aside. So Bismarck returned to his estate to witness the birth of his first child. But Bismarck had a plan. Bismarck always had a plan. You see, even though the liberals had failed to get anything like the constitution they had wanted, they had gotten a constitution, and with it, a parliament, the Landtag. And Bismarck, always a pragmatist under whatever colors he may have worn, decided to get himself elected to this new body.
See, if you can't beat them, join them. If you can't get what you want one way, you get it another way. Obviously, he did not side with this area of things, but he couldn't get what he wanted by being with the conservatives and getting in leadership with them. So then you embrace another way. That's exactly what that is. It's pragmatism. It's understanding the landscape and using that to your advantage.
The fight was fierce. He knew that he wouldn't get elected in his own region, so he decided to run for office in the city of Brandenburg. But there he was an outsider, running against the local mayor. He acted with vigor, describing his campaign headquarters as a military camp, with messengers running in and out at all hours, and strategy being formulated so that he never missed an opportunity to speak to the few hundred men who would eventually determine the representative for Brandenburg. He won by 25 votes.
Ooh.
Now he was once again at the center of things, and the question at hand on everybody's mind was the unification of Germany. If the 39 German states that had survived the Napoleonic invasion banded together, they could change the face of European politics forever.
So let's look at this map for a second, because for most of the last 1,000 years or so, this area has been mostly the Holy Roman Empire. Most of what became Germany was the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire had a lot of other areas as well. But the Holy Roman Empire was dissolved with the Napoleonic Wars. And so because of that, now you've got Prussia, you've got Saxony, you've got all these various powers. You've also got Austria, which has been ruled by the Habsburgs for a long, long time. So it's, there's a lot of turnover in who rules those areas. And now I lost where I was.
If the 39 German states that had survived the Napoleonic invasion banded together, they could change the face of European politics forever. But how to achieve that was a matter of some debate. They could either come together under Austria or under Prussia. But Austria rejected the possibility of unification, because the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Habsburg-inherited lands included far more territory than just the German portions. And the whole point of unification was German nationalism. Germans would never accept rule by a sovereign who was also ruling over other nations. This meant that the Austrians would either have to divide their empire and give some other branch of the family their German territories, or simply reject unification outright, and they chose the latter. The German National Assembly, which was different from the Landtag in that it represented all German states, decided, with little other choice, to offer the imperial crown to Frederick Wilhelm. Nobles in the Landtag, including Bismarck, urged him to accept. But the king rejected the proposal, and this allowed Bismarck the opportunity to rail against the constitution that would have come with it. He was blasted by the press, and sure of losing his seat in the next election. But when the king dissolved the Landtag, he changed the election rules for the next session in ways that favored landowners like Bismarck, which ensured his re-election. After giving some blistering speeches on the role of the monarchy and some strong invectives against even the monarch's own move toward a constitutional unification, Bismarck got himself moved to the new assembly debating the question of unification.
How convenient, right? So he's playing both sides a little bit here. He's willing to rail against the Constitution and be a monarchist when it needs to, but he's also willing to oppose if the monarch is not doing exactly what he feels should be happening for the good of the country. So really, as much as he seems like a loyalist to the monarchy, his real loyalty is to Germany itself, or the idea of Germany, since it doesn't really exist yet.
But before that could go anywhere, he got caught up in the next great conflict. The war over territory seemed to loom between Austria and Prussia, and it is here that we see the evolution of Bismarck. Because though in many ways he was and always would be a man of war, when a settlement was offered and many pushed to reject it and go to war instead, Bismarck rose and said, "It is unworthy of a great state to fight for something which does not concern its own interest. Gentlemen, show me an objective worthy of war, and I will go along with you." It is easy enough for a statesman to ride the popular wave from the comfort of his own fireside, making thunderous speeches from the rostrum, letting the public sound the trumpets of war, and leaving it to the musketeer, bleeding out his life's blood in the snowy wastes to settle whether policies end in glory or in failure.
So this is impressive because, most politicians, if there's a great uproar for war, if there's that jingoism, right? If everybody's clamoring for a fight and nothing, we know nothing unifies a country like getting behind a common cause to go to war over something that you believe in. But here's a guy who could have ridden that wave, who could have taken the popular support and run with it and probably become very, very popular, who sees that it's not necessarily in the best interest of his nation to go to war and is willing to say so. Because as I mentioned a minute ago, his primary concern is not necessarily an ideology of one kind or another. It's what is best for our country. And what he's saying is, this is not what's best for us. Even though it might feel good, even though it might be popular, it's not what's best. And I give him a lot of credit for that.
Nothing is simpler. But woe to any statesman who, at such a time, fails to find a cause of war which will stand up to scrutiny once the fighting is over. And so begins the transformation of Bismarck the Radical to Bismarck, man of realpolitik.
And that's an interesting way to think about war. Nobody really thinks about it that way, because when you're getting ready to get into a war, you're thinking about the here and now. You're thinking about the moment at hand. Here, what he's saying is, we need to think about after this war is over. Are we going to look back and say it was worth it? Now apply that to World War I. And ask any of the countries that were involved: France, Germany, England, Russia, Serbia, Austria, Hungary. At the end of that war, was it worth it? Certainly wasn't worth it to Russia, to Germany, to Austria, Hungary. I'm sure that had they had their way, France and the UK would not have wanted that war if they could have avoided it, because look at how much it cost them. Nobody came out on the other side of that war thinking, man, I'm glad that happened. And that's a great way to think about things. Think about life in general. The decisions you make. Am I going to come out on the other side of the consequences of this decision and be glad I made this decision? That's incredible. The guy was wise beyond his years. I mean, he did some crazy stuff, and he had quite a personality. But boy, he knew what to do when it came down to it. So I'm excited to dive into the next part. We'll do that tomorrow. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe. When we hit 50,000 subscribers, which hopefully will be this week, we're going to be giving away some biographies. The link's in the description for that giveaway if you want to enter. We've had over 1,000 people enter already. So I'm excited to see what happens next. So thanks for watching. We will see you again soon.